did not hit the right button. But I just really wanted to welcome everybody to today's session of the SACME Virtual Journal Club. Introduce the topic of effectiveness of CME as a very important topic to our group. I'm happy to see that we have a lot of colleagues sign up for this topic, and I'm really thrilled to introduce Dr. Donald Moore from Vanderbilt, who's going to lead the discussion and the presentation, and Dr. Kurt Olson, who will lead the facilitation. So Kurt, would you please take it away and introduce John?
Yes, thank you, Mila. And before I do that, just a couple of technical housekeeping kind of items. Just a reminder to avoid using cell phones, cordless phones, speakerphones. You can leave your phone unmuted. I'll be controlling muting, and so that's not something you have to bother with. A couple of procedural things. To ask a question, just use the chat feature. You can use that at any time during the session, and your question will be relayed to the presenter. To make a comment, to get involved in the conversation, raise your hand, and then I'm able to see who has hands up, and I will call on you in turn. So with that, it is truly a pleasure to introduce Dr. Don Moore. He's currently a professor of medical education and administration at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine. He is a skilled educator and researcher. He teaches a course on learning theory and teaching applications. He's very well known to all of us, I'm sure, for his work on the outcomes framework. In fact, his levels of evaluation have become part of our lexicon in the field. We talk in code, so we all know what level 3 in more systems mean. But anyway, delighted to have you with us, Don, and with that, please take it away.
Thank you, Kurt and Mila. It truly is my honor today to be involved in a journal club that will discuss the effectiveness of CME report that Ron Severo and Julie Gaines have put together. Like many of you, I know Ron and have admired his work for years. I'm sorry to say I do not know Julie Gaines, but certainly will be looking for her work in the future. On the screen now is sort of a summary of what we're about to do today. As I mentioned, the article or the report that we'll be looking at is the effectiveness of CME, updated synthesis of systematic reviews. I will be presenting some comments, and Kurt will help with the facilitation of the discussion. But as I'm making my comments, I'd like you to consider 6 questions. These questions were included in the announcement for today's journal club. And I'll just read those questions so that we can internalize them a bit. First question is, are systematic reviews and meta-analysis the right methodologies to investigate the issue of effectiveness? Number 2, did the report we're examining today or the methodologies that they used leave something out? Probably the most important question, what do the findings mean for the day-to-day practice of continuing medical education? Number 4, do we really know what conclusion 3 means? And conclusion 3 indicates that effective CME needs to be more interactive, multiple exposures kind of issues. Number 5, when Severo and Gaines say it will be important to incorporate important to incorporate the insights from the scientific study of CME effectiveness. This is the last phase in the report. What do they mean by that? And then finally, do you agree with their statement that reforming CME is less a knowledge problem than a political problem of changing the systems of which CME is an important constituent element? So this is a very, very important study, as Mila indicated. It's at the heart of most of us do every day. And ever since George Miller's Continuing Education for What article in the 1960s, there have been concerns that CME does not work. The finding in Sibley's report back in the early 80s reinforced those concerns. In many ways, I think, these concerns have prevented us, the field of CME, from reaching its full potential, even though since 1977, as Severo and Gaines report, there have been several meta-analyses that have demonstrated that CME is effective, if that is, certain principles applied. Now, under the auspices of the ACCME, Severo and Gaines have developed a synthesis of the systematic reviews and have produced a more positive picture of CME effectiveness. I'd like to spend a few minutes reviewing the report before we have an opportunity to address the questions that I posed earlier for the Journal Club. And I'm sure that you'll have developed some questions of your own that you want to pose to the people that are on the webinar today, and perhaps ask some specific or ask some specific questions about the report itself. So the purpose of the report was to understand the relationship between the substantial evidence base about the effectiveness of CME and the wider literature of CME reform. The slide on the screen now shows you what the evidence base is, that there were 39 actually articles or systematic reviews that have been published since 1977 that sought to understand the link between continuing education and the performance of health professionals. You can see that Humble and Severo reviewed 16 studies in 1966 in their 1966 article. Robertson was added to that team in 2003, and they reviewed an additional 15. And then Severo and Gaines reviewed 8 systematic reviews that were published since 2003. The results of those studies are 3. First, CME does have a positive impact on physician performance and patient health outcomes. Second, but it has a more reliably positive impact on physician performance than on patient health outcomes. And then CME leads to improvement if it is more interactive, uses more methods, involves multiple exposures, is longer, and addresses outcomes that the participants consider important. I thought it might be useful if we took a look at the articles that were, or the reports that were included in these analyses. In the first collection, done in 1966 by Severo and Humble, you can see that there were 2 waves of studies. One wave looked at is CE effective and for what outcomes, and the second wave was what kinds of CME are successful and why. If you reflect back on the findings of the overall synthesis that Severo and Gaines did, you will see that the first wave are findings 1 and 2. That is, that CME is effective in terms of performance outcomes and patient health status, and that it's more predictive in terms of performance outcomes than it is in terms of health status outcomes. And that the second wave is what kinds of activities are successful, and these reports indicated that it was multiple kinds of activities and the length of activities and so forth. So these are how these studies broke out in terms of those 2 waves. I'd like to just, for your information, review a couple of the titles of those articles so you can get a sense of the kinds of things that they were looking at. As you probably can tell, I'm searching for those right now. So for example, Bertram and Brooks Bertram in 1977, the title of their article was The Evaluation of Continuing Medical Education, a Literature Review. Davis, Haynes, Chambers et al., 1984. The Impact of CME, a Methodological Review of Continuing Medical Education Literature. Let's take a look at Beaudry, 1989, over in the second wave column. The Effectiveness of Continuing Medical Education, a Quantitative Synthesis. And finally, Waddell, 1991. She looked at the effects of continuing education on nursing practice, a meta-analysis. What's important about the titles is that many of these activities or these articles looked at the effectiveness of continuing education in the health professions, not just continuing medical education. Here are the articles rather that were reported by Robertson, Humble, and Severo in 2003. Again, you can see that there were two waves. It appears as if at this point, researchers were pretty well convinced that CE was effective, and so there are considerably more articles in the Wave 2 column. A quick look at some of the titles of these articles. Let's take a look at Wensing and Grohl. Wensing and Grohl's Single and Combined Strategies for Implementing Changes in Primary Care, a Literature Review. If we look at Grant and Stanton, we can come up with a title of The Effectiveness of Continuing Professional Development. So we're beginning to see a switch in terms of performance and continuing professional development. And finally, in the Severo and Gaines article from 2014, we see that it's broken down again into what is the impact of CME and what types of CME are effective and the conditions that affect their effectiveness. And many of us may be more familiar with these articles than we were with the articles in the previous two studies, so I won't go into the titles of these. So let's move on to the next area where Severo and Gaines looked at what they call the literature on reform in CME. So they looked at the Macy Foundation and the Institute of Medicine reports, and they saw that they thought that these reports summarized the evidence-based, showing that CME is effective and that it was generally evidence-based, but the report's overall conclusions were generally and, as they said, paradoxically critical of CME. So why paradoxically? And this is my opinion, not Severo and Gaines, as I participated in the Macy committee meeting that produced that report and reviewed the IOM report. The effectiveness issue was their concern that the effectiveness research had not yet touched the day-to-day practice of CME in most settings. And they were also concerned that that there was still an unhealthy industry influence, particularly an influence on the curriculum of CME, not necessarily biased towards individual products. And what I mean by that is that funding was directed towards certain disease areas as opposed to what might be considered to be the needs patients. They also mentioned three works that provided some suggestions about how CME could improve. One was the Masmanian-Davis-Galbraith article from the CHEST series, talking about the effect of clinical outcomes. we were grateful to see our article on outcomes framework included in those suggestions. And then Jan Ballmer's very important article on the transformation of CME that contributed some suggestions about how to improve the performance of CME. And then finally, they refer to what is called the American Board of Medical Specialties Evidence Library, where there are 220 articles which support the effectiveness of maintenance of certification. You may recall an article or a series of articles in JSEP not so long ago about the effectiveness of maintenance of certification. But in those 220 articles, they identified 129 that demonstrated the positive impact of CME on physician performance and patient health outcomes. So what comes out of this study then is some recognition that CME, if done right, can improve physician performance and patient health outcomes, but it is more likely to improve physician performance. But it has to be performed, or pardon me, it needs to be designed in a way that provides an opportunity for physicians to have multiple opportunities to interact with the content. So what I'd like to do now is to engage the audience, you folks, in a series of questions. Now, you may have some questions of your own, and you can bring them up at any time, of course. But I'd like to start with the first question that I posed, and that is, are systematic reviews and meta-analyses the right methodologies to examine the issue of effectiveness in medical education or CME? And a few prompts are provided here. Systematic reviews, as you know, are used extensively in clinical medicine to summarize the findings from the explosion of clinical trials and are used to guide the development of clinical practice guidelines. So does the same situation hold for educational research? And how important is the quality of the study and the results it produces? That is, in a systematic review, how does one study of lesser quality affect the results of the systematic review? How can we be confident that a systematic review has considered the quality of each of the studies that it has reviewed, and have all the studies, for example, in this particular situation, the one we're reviewing now, have they used the same definition of CME? And if not, what does that mean in terms of what the findings are? And of course, then the $64,000 question is, are randomized controlled trials really the gold standard in terms of determining what's effective and what's not? So I'd like to, with Kurt's help, I'd like to open up the webinar or the Journal Club for questions and comments on this first question.
Yep. And just a reminder, if you want to weigh in, please raise your hand and I will call on you at the earliest opportunity. Right now I'd like to call on Tom Van Hoof.
Thanks. I hope you can hear me. So thanks very much, Don. This is very helpful. So just to respond to the question, I think they can be the right methodologies. The concern that many have raised, though, is the quality of the data, that they're integrating. We know that a lot of even well-designed studies lack sufficient detail about what the intervention actually is. They rely on terms that are often vague. They don't specify dose. They don't specify participation rates. And so, I think that that's a limitation of, frankly, any way of integrating the evidence, is that they often lack a detail about the intervention, never mind the contextual variables, which we think are important. So I guess more of a comment.
Thank you, Tom.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else that would like to weigh in on this? Jack Dokert.
Thank you very much, and Don, thank you for a nice job, and it's a great article to be discussing. I think there's a difference in the focus, the sharpness of randomized clinical trials in the medical therapeutics arena compared to education arena. That is, things I think are more quantifiable, like if the endpoint of a clinical study is death, that's a yes or no. That can be quantified, and if many studies do that, then there are some very sharply defined endpoints. I think in education that's just not possible because you really cannot dig into and have the same sharpness of a person's, the target audience's actions or their whether or not their decisions were correct or not. So I think there's an inherent difference in the ability to do very sharply defined research in clinical care as opposed to education. And if one just takes multiple unsharp studies and combines them together, it's still going to be not very sharply focused. So I think there's just a difference in the nature of the kind of research in the clinical arena where meta-analysis I think is particularly good, and I think it's maybe not as effective in terms of education research. Maybe in fact the way to get the kind of sharp data will ultimately come out of the electronic medical record, and unfortunately the electronic medical record is still in its infancy and there's not good agreement on what a electronic medical record ought to be. So I think that being able to get those sharply defined endpoints will probably evolve, but I don't think it's here yet. So Kurt, back to you.
Thank you. Stuart Gilman.
Hi, thank you. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Nice to talk with you. You know, I think that the problems I have when I even just look at the title is, you know, what do we mean by CME and what do we mean by effective? And just sticking with the CME thing, I mean, as Don was talking earlier about the Macy and IOM reports that commented that although there's evidence that CME is effective, that in part worried them in a way, right? That it was being effective at doing, at achieving improper goals. And I don't think that in our fields we're clear at all when we talk about inquiry in education, whether we're investigating a specific instructional strategy, an activity which probably is a compilation of instructional strategies, a program which will be a compilation of activities, or the enterprise of CME, which is the compilation of all of our work, right? And this all gets kind of jumbled together. And I think we've got to look at the different grain size issues with different kinds of tools. The randomized controlled trial is probably the best research methodology for a discrete component like an instructional strategy. But the premise of an RCT that all things being equal other than the thing that is the experimental variable has no applicability to a complex real world where nothing is equal. And so the generalizability of an RCT for program level interventions is really problematic. And I think we have to use, and use more than we have in our field, use program evaluation strategies that are designed to answer those kinds of questions.
Mm-hmm. Well, Don, any comments to any of the statements from our participants?
I think they all were very, very enlightening. Particularly, I think the way Stu just talked about different grain sizes, I think it creates a very interesting challenge for us in terms of the kinds of things that those of us that are interested in the research side of CME will need to be looking at in the next few years. As a matter of fact, I think there's a question later on that gets at some of that issues and some of those issues in terms of what is it exactly that we're talking about that makes the difference in the effectiveness that Severo and Gaines have reported on. How about if we move on to the second question? So, and there may have been a couple of allusions to this in the three comments we just heard, but did the report or the methodologies leave something out? How can we be sure that it was the CME activities that contributed to the improvements that were noted? Does a systematic review downplay the impact of the multiple variables that interact from the time that a clinician knows what, knows how, shows how it does, when a patient receives those learnings and is faced with a compliance decision? And then finally, what is the role of the context in general in both in the learning environment and the working environment that might have facilitated the effectiveness of the CME activities that were reviewed? So I'd be interested to hear if there are any comments or challenges to not only the question, but the prompts that I used.
So again, please raise your hand and we'll be happy to call on you. Jack Dolkart.
Okay, thank you, Kurt. I think that Don really hit a very important factor here, and that's the context. Because why, if it weren't for the context, the environment that is the learning is being applied, why would it not make a difference for performance versus patient outcomes? So the education, if it only changes the physician performance but doesn't change the patient outcome, then it must be the context, the interprofessional roles, the barriers, or whatever. So I think that's very, very important, maybe as important as any of the things that are going on in the ability to change patient outcomes. Kurt?
Mm-hmm. Stu Gilman.
I don't know how many other folks are on the line. This is a lot of fun to talk with Jack and Don and Kurt. So I don't, anyway, everyone else should come in too. But I think Jack's comment's exactly right, that, you know, context is actually something that makes all the difference in the world in actually implementing something. But it's in our scholarly writing, we tend to minimize it. In the RCT, we actually try to eliminate it, right? We try to pretend that we've controlled for absolutely everything, and everything else is equal but the experimental variable. And in our writings that are, you know, when we're describing things that are short of an RCT, we will describe the setting as a limitation of the study, and we don't tend to say a lot about it. You know, if we do something in our setting, we'd say, well, this happened in the VA. We don't know whether it could be generalizable to other settings. Well, that's a true statement, but not only are we not required to, I mean, we're avoiding, well, what is different about the VA? Why did it do something in the VA, or why might it not have? And how could Jack at the University of Utah think about that to know whether the innovation or accomplishment that occurred in a different context is even applicable to this other context? Our scholarly conventions don't convey that vital information.
Thank you, Stuart. I see that Tom Van Hoof has his hand up again. Tom?
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, I think that in line with the two other comments just made, I think that I've always been humbled by, even when there is improvement at any of the levels, but particularly the higher levels, the level of improvement is, you know, very small to modest. And so it does raise the issue of, you know, that even if these things are done and done well, we're only seeing, not to dismiss it, because at a population level, even a 5 or 10% increase is, you know, is substantial. But nonetheless, we're really only often changing, you know, behavior or outcomes in a very small way, which I think does raise the prospects that the context is really important in from a transformation standpoint, really where perhaps the biggest gains could be made if we could really understand and convey and discuss the contextual variables. We could potentially get a lot more out of our activities.
Thank you, Tom. Alex Jurcic.
So, Tom, that's a great point. Do you sometimes think that we're not writing enough about the context of the situation because it's too long to write it and you have a word limit in journal articles?
Yeah, well, I think that is an issue, but I honestly, and I know that there's been some great articles recently that have, are beginning to lay out what the contextual variables are that should be reported. And so I think one thing is just letting people know how important they are, what they are, and what are the variables that people should be describing in their journal articles.
Very good. Thank you, Tom. At this point, I don't see any other hands up. Oh, I beg your pardon. Mary Turco.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Kurt. Thank you. This is Mary. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I just wanted to comment. I completely agree with what was just said about context. Obviously, it's extremely important. And the other issue, obviously, is complexity. And one of the things we've been looking at is how the complex intervention in the complex environment, meaning context, is really the hardest thing to study. It's extremely complicated, and yet an awful lot of what happens in continuing medical education is exactly that, whether it's a regularly scheduled series like morbidity and mortality conference or a case conference, a research conference, whatever. It's often a very complex intervention happening in such a complex environment within the hospital or the health system that we're going to have to start to address that in what we do to describe what's going on in the activity and what needs to be done to judge the effectiveness of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to build on that a bit, based on some case studies that I did with Tricia Tuman and Carla Alvarado. These are case studies of teams in the hospital setting that have been successful at changing their practice. So these are retrospective. One of the questions we asked was, in what way, if any, did CME contribute to the change? And we were quite astonished to learn of the impact that even didactic forms of CME had on these projects. And in some cases, they provided a critical component, a bit of information at the right time, or something that someone recalled from a past experience, maybe at a conference. But anyway, it led us to argue that we consistently underestimate the impact that CME has, in part because of what Mary is describing, the difficulty of tracing out the effect of a complex intervention in a complex environment.
Something to the effect of don't throw the baby out with the bathwater?
Yeah, that's the one, yeah.
So these first two questions were obviously research-oriented questions. And so I'd like to wrap up this section of questioning, if I may, with a request for maybe some suggestions about how to address the issues that have been raised about perhaps issues with the systematic review, perhaps some way to begin to incorporate textual issues, or maybe studying them independently. Are there approaches in other fields that have been used to get at the what Don Shern calls the messy swamp of professional practice?
Let's see. I see a couple of hands up here from people who have not yet contributed, and I'm unfortunately this person's name I do not know how to pronounce. It looks like Yakoslav.
Yeko. Yeah, thank you. I just have a brief note. I noticed that the report does not mention CPD, and that thing that deserves reflections, because I believe that in Britain they proposed that term 22 years ago with the explanation that the traditional CME approach does not cover the whole of doctors' learning and development needs in modern healthcare. So I'm just curious about your opinion about that.
Yes, thank you, Yeko.
So my opinion about that is maybe not the most popular one, but I think that as you suggested, continuing professional development is a much broader concept than CME, and that for us to understand what works in individual educational activities, we need to focus on the effectiveness of individual CME activities. But at the same time, we do need to have some sort of sense of, once we consider all of these activities as a whole in the, pardon the expression, in the context of a physician's own personal development as he or she moves through his or her career, it then becomes important to take a look at whether or not the approaches they've taken in their efforts to develop continuously over their career have been effective. So I think your point is well taken, and I think the CPD issue probably sits at the top of the different levels, if you'll pardon that expression as well, that Stu Gilman mentioned in terms of different granular sizes of the focus of research projects.
Mm-hmm. Our next commentator is Tanya Horsley. Tanya?
I think this is a fantastic topic, and I think that can you hear me okay?
Getting a bit of an echo, but
yeah, I'm getting a bit of a line. I apologize. I'm on my phone. I can still hear the echo. If it continues, I'll just try to. Oh.
We're getting.
Off for it. It's making too much noise.
Very good. Well, Tanya's working that out. Let's see, I see, oh, Alex, it looks like you have your hand up again, unless I forgot to put it down before, but let's see what you have to say. Alex?
No, you can put it down. I'm good.
Very good. All right, thank you, Alex. So all hands down at this point.
Okay. Well, shall we move on then to the third question? And this is, as I mentioned earlier, this is probably the most important question, and that is, what do the findings mean for the day-to-day practice of CME? Are these findings just more theory and not relevant to your work? How could you use the findings of the Severo-Gaines report? Who would you start with? Your staff, course directors, physicians who participate as CME faculty? How would you start?
Let's see. Sorry, I was busy typing a note to Tanya and have overlooked hands here from Alex Jurcic. Alex?
So Don, my thoughts on this are, despite a lot of literature over the years about the effectiveness of CME, I still have people saying CME has limited effectiveness. And so I'm just using things like summaries to say it can be effective and it's moving in the right direction. So I'm literally using summary statements from this and sending it to people. It's great that it has a URL link and you don't have to go find the original article through PubMed, et cetera. So that's how I'm actually using it when people are telling me, well, what you do is not that effective.
Okay.
Van Hoof?
Yeah, well, I agree with that, but the other thing I like about this article is the reiteration of, frankly, you know, when CME leads to greater improvement, because I've had conversations with people who, you know, are telling me, you know, hey, our passive grand rounds programs, you know, are effective, and and then I'll say, well, there are more effective ways. It could be part of a multifaceted strategy, but when they say, well, you know, this has been shown to be effective, and I say, well, the literature on effectiveness is, you know, is fairly clear that there are important components that make it CME effective, and you know, like the, you know, the more interactive use of multiple methods, multiple exposures, etc. So I think that the article's reiteration of those points is really important as one of the major conclusions.
Thank you, Van. Any reactions, Don?
Well, my position on this question is relatively straightforward, I think. I think finding number 2 is probably pretty important, almost maybe as important as number 3 and 1. And that is, it helps us focus more on our physician participants, that it's that the complexity of being able to improve patient health status is daunting and probably requires a randomized controlled trial. But being able to improve physician performance, I think, gives us a more reasonable target. When I meet with course directors and I ask them what their goals are for their activity, they typically focus on improving patient health status, and we spend a few minutes working back from that because obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but I think that it's important for them to focus their work on improving physician performance because that is probably the more attainable goal given what the research suggests and probably common sense.
Mm-hmm. One implication that this has for me is to underscore the importance of doing good evaluation of our educational programs. Going back to the case studies that I mentioned a while ago, we usually think of improving practice as a process of translating evidence, scientific evidence, into practice, and that's really at the core of the enterprise, so to speak. But what this case study showed was scientific evidence was really on the periphery of these processes, providing the teams that were trying to solve a problem with ideas about what they could do that might make a difference. At the core was not evidence-based practice, but rather practice-based evidence. So it might be an infection rate, for example. So they were watching the needle on the dial to see what had an impact, and that's how they knew whether or not what they were doing was being effective. And so, too, I think for educational interventions, now we don't often have the luxury of having a solid needle on a dial, something that gives us a definitive read on what impact we're having, but you know, we can get the degrees of closeness to that end, I think.
I wanted to go back, Kurt, to the question that I asked at the end of the research section of the questions, and that is what could be done based on the conversation. But perhaps I didn't ask it in the right way. One of the things I think that's very important that is pretty widespread, I think, today in the clinical world is translational research. And I think that the next step, perhaps, or one of the next steps in CME research might be, in terms of translational research, trying to figure out how we can take what Severo and Gaines have reported and make it usable for people in CME offices to help course directors and people who function as faculty in CME activities to understand and be able to use the findings that have been produced.
Reactions to Don's suggestion?
This is Mila. Can you hear me?
Yes. Please go ahead.
So thank you, Don, for that. I think these are really, really relevant questions, and you would think that we've been talking very similar evidence through all of these systematic reviews and individual studies. But it seems like there's so much work still to go on, and be it with faculty or course directors or institutional boards and goals and advisory committees, or the ways that we develop our curriculum and our programs. Anything from, we still need to educate, obviously, about these elements of educational design that are effective, but then transition, and that's what I'm trying to do, and think more about the contextual evidence and the importance, the relevance of the context. And with that, I really mean the motivation of the learners to change and improve, and how do you tackle that in individual context and deal with the relevance. So there's a lot of work to be done, but questions are being asked. We are developing a curriculum in sleep education at Penn, and I actually did get questions from the program committee about what is the evidence, for example, of comparing the effectiveness of live versus enduring and so on. So people are interested in the evidence here, and that's a great opening for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think yours is a very important point, Don. Several things have been running through my head, but one of which is Roger's work on dissemination of innovation. And one of the characteristics of an innovation that makes it more adoptable is the ease with which it can be put into practice. So anything that we can do in the way of practice support aids, in the way that you might have a pocket card for a physician who's learning how to do motivational interviewing, something closer to the point of care, the point of action, to help them take what the research is telling us and apply it to their situation would seem to me to be an important part of the process.
This gets at part of the issue, I think, that I was trying to raise, question 4. Do we really know what conclusion 3 means, more interactive, more methods, multiple exposures? Does it mean to repeat the same thing over and over again until the participants get it right? Or is it a challenge to focus more on what learning science and instructional design tells us about how people learn? Maybe start using something akin to inquiry learning, chunking, cognitive load. That's not an advertisement for Chinese food, by the way. Multiple methods, like the presentation, example, practice, feedback that I'm fond of, using scaffolding and practice and feedback sessions, and using some kind of authentic formative assessment, perhaps. Maybe there are other things that you can think of, but I'm thinking that part of the translational science or translational research should be looking at some of these different kinds of techniques, as opposed to just saying that we need more interactive, more methods. Because when you tell that to a course director, it's hard for him or her to understand precisely what it is that you mean by that. Bill McGahey wrote an article about 3 or 4 years ago when he talked about the translational science in education. And I believe he went through the T1, T2, T3, T4 of translational science in the clinical world, and created a parallel for medical education. And I think that might be a model for us in the future. But I'd like to hear some comments about the specifics here that I'm asking about in question 4, about the specifics of more interactive, more methods, multiple exposures.
Tom would like to comment.
Yeah, thanks, Don. Yeah, so I think that when we offer these recommendations, I think we should follow up with examples of what we mean by more interactive. For example, that term in particular, the adult learning folks will tell us that interaction refers to what's going on in the head of a participant or a set of participants, as opposed to the social interaction, which is a more kind of colloquial definition of interaction. And so, but the adult learning literature, and I've just recently seen 3 very well-written books for kind of lay audiences about adult learning principles and practices, and they're very consistent with all this. And so I think there's an opportunity for us to, integrate what's known from adult learning into, I think our conversations about continuing education.
Thank you for that, Tom. Let's see, next on deck we have Yeko.
Oh, just a short comment that is kind of addition to what's said. Just to add learning theories that we are using to what we are proposing, to back up everything what we are proposing with the specific learning theories. Yeah.
Very good point. Thank you. Well, it looks like that's everyone. Oh, beg your pardon, Stuart Gilman. You are. Please go ahead.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I've been thinking about it. Maybe it's a different conversation about whether the translational metaphor works. But I think a metaphor that definitely is easier to digest is the analogy between health services research and education services research. We have a fair bit that we do know about what effective interventions are, but what we're talking about here is our lack of understanding of how to get those interventions systematically in place for usual practice. And I think that's a significant area for inquiry and intervention that we should be working towards.
Yep, I like that analogy. It also makes me think about what it means to use the research. We often think of it in instrumental terms, and as far as looking for a study that is going to give us a solution to a problem that we're working on. But there are many other ways to use the research. One is it can certainly give us a leg up in terms of pointing us to the right direction, things that will increase the probability that we'll be successful. But I guess in that sense it comes back to evaluation. It still is up to us as CE practitioners to be monitoring impact and to be working out what works best for our learners in our settings, given the resources that we have available. Next, I'll call on Al Aparicio. Al? Please go ahead, Al. I think Al may have his phone muted. Let's see, we can perhaps come back to him in a moment. In the meantime, Don, do you have any observations?
No more on this point. I'd like to move on to since our time is running short, to the next set of questions. Not that one. That one.
Excuse me, while you're doing that, Don, let me just see if Al has been able to get online here. Al? Nope, still no luck. Okay, I beg your pardon, Don. Please go ahead.
So this takes this to the next level, I think, in terms of questioning what we need to do next. And pretty well, I think that this group has decided that these findings are important, but there's more work to be done. And so what else do we need to know? And I think that the Realist evaluation framework provides a useful lens to begin to look at the contextual issues that we were discussing before, the translational science kinds of things that we just mentioned, in terms of what their framework is, and that is what works for whom under what circumstances. So I'd like to hear some comments on that and whether or not anyone has had some experience working with the Realist framework.
Let's see, while we're waiting for a reaction to that question, actually we have one now. Stu Gilman.
Hi, thanks, Don. I'm glad you talked about the Realist framework because that does kind of get to the question of the randomized controlled trial and also to the question of what is it you want to know. And it's the difference is, like, I think that the RCT is X better than Y. But the question for program implementation is a lot more complicated, which is what works and why. We've used we've attempted to use a Realist evaluation. I actually did use one in evaluating an advanced fellowship program, the VA Quality Scholars Program, a few years ago, and we've been attempting to use, we'll call it a modified Realist strategy in evaluating our centers of excellence in primary care education. It's not an easy evaluation strategy to use. It's a multifactorial, multidimensional, mixed methods approach that requires somebody to run it who's really got a lot of expertise in those kinds of methodologies. And it ends up producing reports that aren't going to be familiar looking to people who are used to consuming, I'll say, traditional educational research.
Very good. We have just about 1 or 2 minutes here, and thank you very much for that comment, Stuart. I'm glad to hear somebody is developing some experience with Realist evaluation. Don, any closing comments in the final 60 to 90 seconds here?
Just to say that I'm excited that someone of Ron's stature decided to take a look at systematic reviews in a historical sense, and to show that there has been some consistent evidence, though it may not be as strong as we would all like, that shows that CME works if it's done properly. I think the challenge for us is to begin to think about a research agenda that focuses a little bit more on what does all this mean in terms of the individual or individuals who are working on the front lines of CME, and what can we produce for them that'll make it easier for CME to be done in the way where we know it'll be more effective. I also think that there are exciting possibilities for CME as our healthcare system is moving into much more of a system-oriented healthcare system ACO kind of approach, and that the next challenge for us as CME providers will be to integrate ourselves into this emerging new system in a way that we can provide value to systems that are emerging, to borrow the SACME phrase that we can be a strategic asset. And this work is that way.
Well, thank you very much, Don. This has been a tremendous session. Thank you to everyone who contributed, everyone who took part. And with that, this journal club is concluded.